Sometimes a man reaches that point in life where going home feels like the only choice left, even when home doesn't want you back. For old Hank Travers, returning to Montana after 20 years meant facing the laughter and the whispers of folks who'd written him off long ago. His cabin was falling apart, moss-covered and sagging. The townspeople called it total crap. They figured Hank had come back to die in that wreck of a place, and maybe he had. He brought nothing but his dog Copper and his brother's unopened letter from 2 decades past. But Copper started digging under the old floorboards and found something nobody expected. Hidden beneath the rot and ruin was a fortune that would silence every laugh and change everything. What would an old man do with a second chance he never asked for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The road into Pinewood Valley hadn't changed much in 20 years, though Hank suspected he had changed plenty. The asphalt still cracked in the same places, weeds pushing through like stubborn memories that refused to stay buried. Pine trees crowded both sides of the 2-lane highway, their shadows long and cool even in the afternoon sun. Hank drove his old Ford pickup, a '98 model he'd bought off a ranch hand in Wyoming for $800 cash, with both hands on the wheel and his eyes fixed straight ahead. Copper sat in the passenger seat, tongue lolling, ears perked at every passing scent that drifted through the open window. The town appeared gradually, the way small mountain towns always do. First came the outlying properties, double wides with rusty swing sets, a few horse pastures with sagging fences, an old grain silo that hadn't held grain since the '80s. Then the businesses, Murphy's Feed and Supply, the Riverside Diner with its faded red sign, Hanson's Auto Repair with 3 vehicles in various states of disassembly. Hank noticed a new gas station where the old lumber yard used to be, all bright colors and LED signs that seemed too loud for a place like this. He didn't stop in town. His brother's letter sat in the glove compartment, the envelope so old the paper had gone soft as cloth. Hank had carried that letter with him for 2 decades, moved it from one rented room to another, from Seattle to Denver to a dozen places in between. He'd worked construction jobs, warehouse shifts, anything that paid cash, and didn't ask too many questions. The letter had followed him like a ghost he couldn't shake and couldn't face, until 3 months ago, when the doctor in Cheyenne had given him the news. 6 months, maybe a year if he was lucky. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that moved fast and didn't leave much room for negotiation. Hank had nodded, thanked the man, and walked out into the parking lot where Copper was waiting in the truck. That night, in a motel room that smelled like stale cigarettes and pine cleaner, Hank had finally opened his brother's letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Ray's, loose and sprawling. The kind of penmanship that came from a man who'd rather be doing anything other than writing. The date on top read March 15th, 2005. Hank, I know you said you weren't coming back, and I respect that. A man's got to follow his own path, even when that path leads him away from home. But I wanted you to know some things before it's too late. The cabin is still standing, though barely. I've been keeping an eye on it when I can, but my health isn't what it used to be. Doctor says my ticker's giving out. There's something I never told you about the old place. But made me promise never to speak of it, said it was family business and family business alone. But seeing as you're the only family left once I'm gone, I figure you have a right to know. The cabin holds more than memories, brother. Pa always said a man's home is his castle, and every castle needs a treasury. I never understood what he meant until I found it myself, quite by accident, when I was fixing the floor in '89. I've left everything as it was. Never touched it, never told a soul. It's yours now, or it will be when you're ready to claim it. The deed's in the county records office, transferred to your name last year. Don't let the townfolk tell you different. That land is Travers' land, always has been. And what's buried there belongs to us. Your brother Ray Hank had read the letter 3 times that night, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. The next morning he'd loaded Copper into the truck, pointed it north and started driving. Now, as he turned off the main road onto the old logging trail that led up into the hills, Hank felt something loosen in his chest. The trail was overgrown, branches scraping against the sides of his truck, but it was passable. He shifted into four-wheel drive and kept going, the engine groaning as they climbed higher into the mountains. The cabin sat in a clearing about 3 miles off the main road, nestled between two ridges covered in Douglas fir and lodgepole pine. Hank stopped the truck about 50 yards away and just sat there for a moment, taking it in. It looked worse than he'd imagined. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, moss growing so thick across the shingles it looked like someone had thrown a green blanket over the whole structure. The front porch tilted at an angle that defied basic physics, held up by posts that had rotted through at the base. Windows were either cracked or missing entirely, covered with pieces of plywood that had weathered to the color of old bones. The whole place leaned slightly to the left, as if even the building itself wanted to lie down and give up. "Well, Copper," Hank said, killing the engine. "Guess the jokes are earned." The dog whined softly, sensing his master's mood. They got out of the truck and Hank stood there in the clearing, breathing in the mountain air. It smelled like pine sap and wild grass, and something else he couldn't quite name. Memory, maybe, or time itself. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Hank had been born in this cabin 63 years ago. His mother had died here when he was 7. Pneumonia that came on fast during a hard winter. His father had raised him and Ray here, taught them to hunt and fish and live off the land. The old man had been tough as boot leather, fair when he needed to be, hard when circumstances demanded it. He died when Hank was 25, a stroke that took him quick while he was chopping wood. Ray had stayed. Hank had left. That was the simple truth of it. Ray had wanted to keep the family land, maintain the traditions. Hank had wanted something else. What exactly, he'd never been quite sure. Just something different. They'd argued about it the day after their father's funeral. Words had been said that couldn't be unsaid. Hank had packed his truck and driven away, and for 20 years he'd kept driving, never quite finding what he was looking for. Now here he was, back at the beginning, with nothing to show for all those years except a dying body, a loyal dog, and questions that needed answering. Hank walked slowly toward the cabin, Copper trotting ahead to investigate. The dog sniffed around the foundation, tail wagging. Hank stepped carefully onto the porch, testing each board before putting his full weight on it. Most of them held. A few creaked ominously. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, the wood swollen from years of moisture. Hank had to put his shoulder into it to push it open. It scraped across the floor with a sound like an old man's last breath. Inside, the cabin was dim and musty. Dust covered everything, the old wood stove in the corner, the rough-hewn table his father had built by hand, the 2 chairs that still sat on opposite sides, like they were waiting for an argument that would never come. Animal droppings littered the floor. A family of mice had made a nest in what remained of the curtains, but it was still standing. Against all odds and common sense, the cabin remained. Hank walked through the single room slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The floorboards groaned under his weight, some of them sagging dangerously. He could see daylight through gaps in the walls where the chinking had fallen away. The roof had leaked in a dozen places, leaving dark water stains across the ceiling beams. In the back corner, his old bunk was still there, the mattress long since consumed by mildew and time. Ray's bunk sat across from it in the same condition. Their father's bed, larger and set against the far wall, had collapsed entirely. Hank found himself standing in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking in every detail. This was where he'd learned to walk, to read, to tie his boots, to clean a fish. This was where his mother had sung to him on winter nights, where his father had taught him that a man's word was the only currency that truly mattered. This was where he'd become who he was, for better or worse, and according to Ray's letter, this was where his father had hidden something worth coming back for. Copper barked from outside, sharp and insistent. Hank went to the door and saw the dog standing at attention, staring down the trail. A moment later, Hank heard it too. The sound of an engine laboring up the mountain road. A truck appeared through the trees. newer than Hank's, a big Dodge with oversized tires and a light bar across the top. It pulled into the clearing and stopped. Two men got out. The first was in his 40s, thick across the middle, wearing a brown sheriff's uniform and a hat with a wide brim. He had the kind of face that smiled easy but meant none of it. The second man was younger, maybe 30, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen actual outdoor work. Pressed khakis, a flannel shirt that probably cost more than Hank's entire outfit, hiking boots so clean they practically gleamed. The sheriff walked forward, thumbs hooked in his belt, that false smile already spreading across his face. "Help you with something, friend?" Hank stepped off the porch, Copper moving to stand beside him. "This is my land. I'm Hank Travers." The sheriff's smile didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Travers!" "Heard that name. You're Ray's brother, that right?" "I am. Sorry for your loss. Ray was a good man." The sheriff didn't sound particularly sorry. "I'm Sheriff Dawson. This here's Mr. Garrett. He's a developer, works out of Missoula." The younger man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Tom Garrett. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Travers." Hank didn't take the offered hand. After a moment, Garrett lowered it, that practiced smile never faltering. "The thing is," Sheriff Dawson said, "there's been some confusion about this property. Counties had questions about the deed, about whether it was properly transferred. And frankly, Mr. Travers, this structure here," he gestured at the cabin, "it's a hazard. Should have been condemned years ago." "Structure's fine," Hank said flatly. "With respect, sir, it's really not. I can see daylight through the walls from here. Roof's about to cave in. It's a danger to anyone who might wander up here. Good thing I'm not planning to inhabit it long," Hank said. Garrett stepped forward again, all smooth charm and calculated friendliness. "Mr. Travers, I represent a development group that's very interested in this area. We're looking to create a mountain resort, upscale cabins, a lodge, maybe a small ski operation. Nothing too big, very tasteful, very respectful of the environment. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for this land. Land's not for sale. You haven't heard the offer yet. Don't need to." "It's not for sale." Garrett's smile tightened just slightly. "Mr. Travers, I don't think you understand the situation here. This property, in its current condition, is essentially worthless. The cabin's beyond repair. The land itself is landlocked. You'd need an easement just to get regular access. The county's going to come after you for back taxes, property maintenance violations, environmental issues. You're looking at tens of thousands in fines and fees. Then I guess I'll deal with that when the time comes." Sheriff Dawson shifted his weight, his hand moving closer to his belt. "Mr. Travers, I'm trying to be neighborly here, but you need to understand something. Times have changed. This valley's growing. We've got rules now, regulations. You can't just show up after 20 years and expect everything to be like you left it." "Didn't expect anything," Hank said. "Just came home." "This isn't your home anymore," Dawson said, and the false friendliness had drained from his voice entirely. "This is a derelict structure on disputed land, and you're trespassing. Got the deed that says different. Do you?" "I'd like to see it." Hank met the sheriff's eyes and said nothing. After a long moment, Garrett cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, let's not get heated here. Mr. Travers, clearly you've had a long drive. Why don't you think about our offer? Take a few days, get the lay of the land, so to speak. We're talking about enough money that you could live very comfortably for the rest of your years." "Already got a place to live," Hank said, nodding toward the cabin. The two men exchanged a look. Finally, Sheriff Dawson shook his head. "Your funeral, old-timer. But don't be surprised when the county inspector shows up with a condemnation notice. And don't be surprised when you find yourself on the wrong side of the law." They got back in their truck without another word. The engine roared to life, and they turned around in the clearing, kicking up dust and gravel. As they disappeared back down the trail, Hank stood there with Copper beside him, watching until the sound of the engine faded completely. "Well, Copper," he said quietly, "looks like we're not exactly welcome." The dog looked up at him. Tongue-lolling, tail-wagging slowly, Hank turned back to the cabin, studying it with fresh eyes. If what Ray's letter said was true, this wreck of a building held something valuable enough that people were already circling like vultures. He'd have to be careful. But first, he needed to find what his brother had left for him. The sun was getting lower in the sky, shadows lengthening across the clearing. Hank went back to his truck and started unloading his things. A sleeping bag, a cooler with a few days' worth of food, a kerosene lantern, his rifle, and a small toolkit. It wasn't much, but then, he'd never needed much. As he carried his gear into the cabin, Copper already exploring every corner, Hank felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. It was purpose. For the first time in 20 years, he had a reason to wake up tomorrow beyond simple, stubborn survival. Whatever was hidden beneath these old floorboards, whatever his father and brother had kept secret all these years, Hank was going to find it. And he was going to make damn sure that the town that had laughed at him, the developers who wanted to steal his land, and the corrupt sheriff who'd come up here to intimidate him, they were all going to regret underestimating a dying old man who had nothing left to lose. Hank spent the first night in his sleeping bag on the floor, listening to the cabin settle and creak around him. Copper slept nearby, occasionally lifting his head at some distant sound. An owl hunting, a deer moving through the brush, the wind shifting through the pines. The kerosene lantern cast flickering shadows across the walls. Sleep was stubborn these days. The pain in his gut came and went, sometimes dull and distant, other times sharp enough to take his breath away. The doctor had given him pills, but Hank was rationing them. A man with 6 months to live couldn't afford to waste anything. When the first light of dawn filtered through the gaps in the walls, Hank gave up on sleep entirely. He got up, lit the lantern, and started examining the floor in earnest. The floorboards were pine, hand-cut and hand-laid by his grandfather sometime in the 1940s. Now they were warped and water-stained, some of them rotted clear through. Hank walked slowly across the room, testing each board with his weight, listening for hollow sounds, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Copper watched from his spot by the door. Head tilted, Hank worked methodically, starting at the far corner and moving in a grid pattern. He'd learned patience in his years away. Construction work taught you that. You couldn't rush a job and expect it to hold. By mid-morning, he'd covered about half the floor and found nothing. His knees ached from kneeling. His back protested every time he stood up, and the pain in his gut had settled into a steady, grinding presence. He was about to take a break when Copper suddenly stood up, ears perked, staring at the floor near the old wood stove. "What is it, boy?" The dog walked over to the spot and started sniffing intently, his tail wagging. Then he began to paw at the floorboards, his nails clicking against the wood. "Easy there," Hank said, moving over to where Copper was digging. "Let me have a look." He knelt down and examined the boards. At first glance, they looked like all the others. But as Hank ran his fingers along the edges, he felt something different. These boards had been cut and replaced. The nail heads were newer, less rusted, and when he tapped on them, they sounded hollow. His heart started beating faster. Hank pulled out his pocket knife and worked the blade between two boards, prying gently. The first board came up with a groan, revealing the dark space beneath. Copper whined and pushed his nose closer, sniffing eagerly. "Good boy," Hank said quietly. "Good boy, Copper." He removed 2 more boards, widening the opening. The cabin had been built on a foundation of stacked stones with about 2 feet of crawl space underneath. In the dim light, Hank could make out something sitting on the bare earth, a metal box, maybe 1.5 feet long and 1 foot wide, covered in dust and cobwebs. Hank reached down and pulled it up. The box was heavier than he expected, made of tin that had rusted in places but still held together. There was no lock, just a simple latch that opened with a metallic click. He set the box on the floor and opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of bills. Old bills, the kind Hank hadn't seen in circulation for decades. 20s and 50s and 100s, bundled with rubber bands that had rotted away. Beneath the cash were gold coins, $20 Liberty coins, Indian head eagles, Morgan silver dollars, dozens of them. And at the bottom, wrapped in a separate piece of oilcloth, was a document. Hank pulled out the document with shaking hands and unfolded it carefully. It was a deed dated 1923, transferring ownership of mineral rights for the entire ridge, not just the cabin property, but 200 acres surrounding it, to his grandfather, Samuel Travers. The signature at the bottom was official, notarized, stamped with the seal of the Montana Territory, mineral rights. His grandfather had owned the mineral rights to 200 acres of mountain land, and nobody had known about it. Hank sat back on his heels, the deed in one hand, his mind racing. This changed everything. The land wasn't just a family homestead anymore. If there were minerals up here, gold, silver, copper, the rights to extract them belonged to whoever held this deed, and now that was him. He looked at Copper, who was still wagging his tail, pleased with himself. "Well, boy," Hank said softly, "I think we just found out why Garrett and his friends are so interested in our little piece of nowhere." He carefully folded the deed and put it back in the oilcloth, then started counting the money. When he was finished, he'd counted just over $43,000 in old currency, plus another $30,000 or so in gold and silver coins. $73,000, give or take, hidden under the floorboards of a cabin that most people thought was worthless. But the real value wasn't in the cash. It was in that deed. Mineral rights in Montana could be worth millions, depending on what was actually in the ground. And if Garrett's development group knew about those rights, that explained everything. The pressure to sell, the sheriff's threats, the convenient questions about the property deed. They wanted this land. Not for a ski resort. They wanted what was under it. Hank packed everything carefully back into the tin box and considered his options. He could take the money and run. $73,000 would be more than enough to live comfortably for whatever time he had left. He could go somewhere warm, somewhere far from here, but even as the thought crossed his mind, Hank knew he wouldn't do it. This was his land, his family's land. His grandfather had earned it. His father had protected it. His brother had kept the secret. Ray had trusted him with this, and besides, Hank thought with a grim smile, he was a dying man anyway. What did he have to be afraid of? He was still sitting there, the tin box open in front of him, when he heard vehicles coming up the trail. Multiple vehicles. Copper heard them too, and started barking, moving toward the door. Hank stood up, his hand instinctively moving to where his rifle leaned against the wall. He grabbed it and went to the window, peering through a gap in the plywood. 3 trucks were pulling into the clearing. Sheriff Dawson's Dodge in front, followed by 2 white pickups with the county seal on the doors. As Hank watched, 6 men got out, Dawson, Tom Garrett, and 4 others wearing county work shirts and hard hats. One of them was carrying a clipboard. Another had a camera. Hank carefully placed the tin box back in the hole under the floorboards and replaced the boards as quickly as he could, using his boot to stomp them down. It wouldn't pass close inspection, but from across the room, it looked undisturbed. Then he went to the door, rifle in hand, and stepped out onto the porch. Sheriff Dawson looked up at him, that false smile back in place. "Morning, Mr. Travers. Got some folks here from the county building department. They need to do an inspection of the structure." "Not a good time," Hank said. "Wasn't asking permission," Dawson replied. "This is official business. You can cooperate, or you can be arrested for obstruction. Your choice." The men with the clipboards and camera were already walking toward the cabin. Hank stood in the doorway, blocking their path, the rifle held loosely across his chest. "This is my property," he said quietly. "You need a warrant to come inside." Dawson's smile disappeared entirely. "Old man, you're about 2 seconds away from spending the night in my jail. Now step aside." Hank didn't move. His finger stayed well away from the trigger, but the message was clear. This was his land, his home, and they weren't welcome. For a long moment, nobody moved. The mountain air was cool and still, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of rain. Finally, Tom Garrett stepped forward, his hands raised. "Mr. Travers, please. We're just trying to help. The county has legitimate safety concerns. We need to document its condition." "That's all? Then you won't mind coming back when I've had a chance to consult with a lawyer," Hank said. "A lawyer?" Garrett's expression suggested this was ridiculous. "Mr. Travers, do you have any idea how much lawyers cost?" "I'll manage." Dawson stepped forward, his hand on his belt. "Last chance, old-timer. Step aside, or I'll move you aside. Hank looked at the sheriff, then at Garrett, then at the 4 county workers who were trying very hard to look like they didn't want to be part of whatever was about to happen. He thought about the deed under the floorboards, about the money and coins, about his brother's letter and his father's legacy. He thought about having 6 months to live and nothing to lose but his pride. And then he smiled, a cold, hard smile that showed more teeth than humor, and said the words that would change everything. "Come back with a warrant, Sheriff. Or don't come back at all." They left, but not before Sheriff Dawson promised he'd be back with that warrant before the day was out. Hank watched them drive away, then stood there in the clearing for a long time, thinking about what came next. He wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a businessman, wasn't anybody with the kind of connections that could help him navigate what was coming. He was just an old construction worker with cancer and a stubborn streak. But he knew one thing for certain. He needed help, and he needed it fast. Inside the cabin, Hank pulled the tin box back out from under the floorboards and counted out $2,000 in old bills. It was a risk carrying that much cash into town, but he didn't have a bank account anymore. Cash was simpler. Cash didn't leave a trail. He tucked the money into his jacket pocket, made sure Copper had water and a bowl of kibble, and headed back down the mountain in his old Ford Pinewood Valley. Looked different in the full light of day. The main street was wider than he remembered, paved now instead of gravel. There were more businesses, a coffee shop, a boutique selling outdoor gear, a wine bar that seemed wildly out of place. The old hardware store was still there, though, and Murphy's Feed and Supply, and the Riverside Diner with its faded red sign. Hank parked in front of the diner and went inside. The place smelled like coffee and bacon grease, familiar and comforting. The booths were still the same cracked red vinyl. The counter still had those spinning stools. And the walls were covered with faded photographs of local history, logging crews, the old mill, high school football teams. There were maybe a dozen people inside. The conversations died down when Hank walked in. Eyes followed him as he made his way to an empty booth in the back corner. A waitress approached, maybe 50 years old, with tired eyes and grey hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please. And the breakfast special if you're still serving." "We serve breakfast all day." She poured his coffee without looking at him, then headed back to the kitchen. Hank sat there, warming his hands on the mug, listening to the whispers starting up around him. He caught fragments. Travers' brother? Up at the old cabin? Heard Dawson went up there this morning? Word traveled fast in small towns. Always had. The waitress brought his food, eggs, bacon, hash browns, toast, and set it down without comment. Hank thanked her and started eating. He was halfway through his meal when someone slid into the booth across from him. Hank looked up to find a woman, maybe in her late 50s, with steel-grey hair cut short and sharp blue eyes that studied him with open curiosity. She wore jeans and a faded flannel shirt, work boots that had seen actual work. There was something familiar about her face. "Hank Travers," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right, you don't remember me, do you?" Hank studied her face more carefully. Something in the eyes, the set of her jaw. Then it clicked. "Sarah." "Sarah Morrison." "Sarah Holland now. Went back to my maiden name about 10 years ago." She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "You and Ray used to walk me home from school sometimes. Back when we were all young and stupid," Hank remembered. Sarah Morrison had lived down the valley. Her father had worked at the mill, drank too much, died young. Sarah had been smart, though. "Sharp as a tack. You still here?" he asked. "Never left. Married, had 2 kids, got divorced, raised them on my own. They're grown now, living in Seattle. I teach at the elementary school." She paused. "I was sorry to hear about Ray. He was a good man. He was. And I heard you're back. Heard you had a visit from Sheriff Dawson this morning." Hank took a sip of his coffee. "News travels fast. Always has. Listen, Hank, I'm going to be straight with you. You're in trouble. Dawson's in Tom Garrett's pocket. Has been for 3 years now. Garrett and his development group have been buying up land all through this valley, promising jobs and prosperity. But what they're really doing is pushing people out. They lowball offers, file complaints with the county, dig up old property disputes. And what they want is your land. Figured that much out already. Did you figure out why? Hank met her eyes, but said nothing. Sarah leaned forward slightly. There's been talk. Rumors about mineral surveys done up in those hills back in the 20s. Gold, maybe. Silver. Copper. Nobody knew for sure, but Garrett's group did their homework. They know something's up there, and they know your grandfather had mineral rights to that whole ridge. How do you know all this? Because I pay attention, because I listen, and because my son works for the county surveyor's office in Missoula. He's seen the maps, the old claims, the new surveys. She paused. And he told me that if you've got the original deed to those mineral rights, you're sitting on a fortune. But only if you can hold on to it long enough to prove ownership. Hank pushed his plate aside, his appetite suddenly gone. Why are you telling me this? Because Ray was my friend. Because this valley used to mean something before people like Garrett showed up. And because I'm tired of watching good people get pushed around. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket and slid it across the table. This is the name and number of a lawyer in Kalispell. Margaret Chen. She's expensive, but she's good and she doesn't scare easy. She helped the Johnsons keep their ranch when Garrett tried to force them out last year. Tell her I sent you. Hank took the paper and looked at it. The name was written in neat, precise handwriting. I can't afford an expensive lawyer, he said. You can't afford not to have one. Sarah stood up. Call her today, Hank, before Dawson gets that warrant. Once they're inside that cabin, once they see what you found, if you found anything, they'll find a way to take it from you. She walked away before he could respond. Pausing at the counter to pay for her coffee, then heading out into the bright Montana morning, Hank sat there for a long time, looking at the name on the paper. Margaret Chen, attorney at law, a phone number with a Kalispell area code. He finished his coffee, left money on the table, and walked out to his truck. The sun was higher now, warming the valley. Burning off the morning mist that clung to the hills, Hank pulled out his cell phone, a cheap prepaid thing he'd bought at a gas station in Wyoming, and dialed the number. Sarah had given him. A woman answered on the third ring. Chen Law Office. My name is Hank Travers, he said. Sarah Holland told me to call. I need a lawyer, and I need one fast. There was a pause. Then how fast? Today, if possible. Maybe sooner. Another pause. Mr. Travers, my consultation fee is $500, and my retainer starts at $10,000. Before we go any further, I need to know if you can afford my services. Hank thought about the tin box under the floorboards, about the $73,000 in cash and coins, about the deed that might be worth millions. I can afford it, he said. Then I can see you this afternoon. 3 o'clock. Don't be late, and bring every document you have related to your property. She hung up before he could say anything else. Hank stood there in the parking lot, phone in hand, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, exactly. Not confidence. But something like determination. Something like the understanding that he'd just made a choice. And there was no going back from it now. He got in his truck and headed back up the mountain. Back to the cabin, back to Copper and the hidden fortune and whatever came next. Back at the cabin, Hank found Copper waiting on the porch, tail wagging. The dog had good instincts. He knew when to stay put and when to raise hell. Hank scratched behind his ears and went inside to gather what documents he had. There wasn't much. Ray's letter, yellowed and creased from being carried in his pocket for so long. The deed to the mineral rights, still wrapped in oilcloth. An old photograph he'd found in the tin box, his grandfather standing in front of the cabin. Stern-faced and weathered, probably taken sometime in the 1940s, and tucked into the corner of the box, a handwritten ledger that detailed expenses and income from the property going back to 1923. Hank spread everything out on the old wooden table and studied it. His grandfather's handwriting was meticulous, each entry dated and categorized. There were notes about timber sales, about hunting permits, about repairs made to the cabin. And there, on a page dated August 1923, was a single line that made Hank's breath catch. Mineral rights secured. 200 acres, paid in full. No mention of how much was paid, or to whom, or what exactly those rights entailed. Just that simple notation, as if it were no more significant than buying a new axe handle. Hank carefully placed everything in a canvas bag he'd found in his truck. He had 2 hours before his meeting with Margaret Chen, enough time to get to Kalispell if he didn't run into trouble. He was locking the cabin door when he heard a vehicle coming up the trail. Faster than was safe for the rutted logging road, Copper started barking. Hank's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but when the truck emerged from the trees, it was an old Chevy pickup, forest green with patches of rust. And the man who climbed out was someone Hank recognized immediately, Pete Carver. He'd been a few years ahead of Hank in school, a logger's son who'd gone into logging himself. He was probably 60 now, with a grey beard and a gut that spoke to too many years of hard work followed by easier living. But his eyes were sharp, and his handshake when he extended it was firm. Hank Travers. "Heard you were back, Pete." Hank shook his hand. "Been a long time. 20 years, give or take." Pete looked at the cabin, then back at Hank. "Listen, I'm not here for a social call. I'm here because I owe Ray a debt, and since he's gone, I figure I owe it to you instead." "What kind of debt?" "The kind where a man saves your life and you never forget it." Pete leaned against his truck. "Back in '03, Ray was working timber with me. Had an accident. Tree came down wrong, pinned my leg. Ray got me out, kept me from bleeding to death, drove me 40 miles to the hospital. Doctors said another hour and I'd have lost the leg." Hank nodded slowly. "That sounded like Ray. So here's what I need to tell you," Pete continued. "Tom Garrett and his people, they're not just developers. They're connected to mining interests down in Butte, folks with deep pockets and no conscience. Word is, they've done surveys on your ridge, illegal surveys, and they found something. Copper deposits mainly, maybe some rare earth elements. Worth millions if they can get to it. How do you know this?" "Because my nephew works for the surveying company they hired. He told me about it last month. Said they were mapping your property without permission, flying drones over it, taking soil samples. He felt bad about it, but needed the work." Pete spat into the dirt. "These people don't play fair, Hank. They'll use the law when it suits them, and they'll break it when it doesn't. And Dawson, he's bought and paid for." Hank felt a cold anger settling in his chest. "So what do I do?" "You fight. You get a good lawyer. You document everything and you don't back down. But you also watch your back, because these folks have made people disappear before. Nothing you can prove, but people who cause them trouble have a way of having accidents." Pete looked at him hard. "You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand." "Good. I also brought you something." Pete walked to the bed of his truck and pulled out a cardboard box. "Motion-activated trail cameras. Got 6 of them. Set them up around your property line. They'll capture anyone coming or going, send images straight to your phone if you've got service. It's not much, but it's something." Hank took the box, surprised by the weight of it. "Pete, I can't. You can and you will. Like I said, I owe Ray." Pete climbed back into his truck. "One more thing. There's a town meeting tomorrow night at the community center. Garrett's presenting his development plan to the council. You should be there. Show them you're not going anywhere. I'll think about it. Don't think, do." Pete started his engine. "And Hank? Get yourself a better lock for that door. And maybe sleep with that rifle close. I mean it about watching your back." He drove away, leaving Hank standing there with a box of trail cameras and a growing sense that he was in deeper than he'd realized. Copper nuzzled his hand, whining softly. "I know, boy," Hank said quietly. "I know." He spent the next 30 minutes setting up 2 of the cameras, one pointing down the main trail, another covering the clearing. The instructions were simple enough, and his phone managed to connect to the camera's wireless signal. He tested them by walking in front of each one, and his phone buzzed with notifications showing grainy images of himself. It wasn't foolproof, but it was something. By the time he finished, it was past 2 o'clock. Hank loaded Copper into the truck and started the drive to Kalispell. The highway cut through pine forests and open meadows, following the river valley north. The scenery was beautiful in that Montana way. Big sky, bigger mountains, everything painted in shades of green and blue and gray. He made it to Kalispell with 15 minutes to spare. Margaret Chen's office was in a brick building near the courthouse 2nd floor. with her name on a brass plate beside the door. Hank took a breath, grabbed the canvas bag with his documents, and headed inside. The reception area was small but professional. A young woman sat typing on a computer. She looked up when Hank entered. "Mr. Travers." "That's right. Miss Chen is expecting you." "Go right in." The office beyond was lined with bookshelves filled with legal volumes and case files. Margaret Chen sat behind a large wooden desk, reviewing something on her laptop. She looked up when Hank entered, and he saw a woman in her mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that assessed him in about 3 seconds flat. "Mr. Travers, sit down." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sarah Holland speaks highly of you. She also told me you're up against Tom Garrett and his development group." "That true?" "It is." "Then you're in for a fight. Garrett doesn't lose often, and he doesn't lose gracefully." She leaned back in her chair. "Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out." "I can't help you if I don't know what we're dealing with." So Hank told her. About Ray's letter, about the cabin, about finding the tin box and the deed to the mineral rights, about Sheriff Dawson's threats and the inspection attempt, about what Pete had said regarding illegal surveys and mining interests. Margaret listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad with quick, precise strokes. When Hank finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Let me see the deed." Hank unwrapped the oilcloth and carefully unfolded the deed, placing it on Margaret Chen's desk. She leaned forward, adjusting her reading glasses, and studied it in silence for what felt like a long time. Finally, she sat back and looked at him. "This is legitimate. The seal is authentic, the signatures check out, and the legal language is consistent with Montana territorial law from that era. Your grandfather owned the mineral rights to this entire ridge, and according to the chain of title, those rights now belong to you. So I own it. You own the mineral rights, yes, but that's where things get complicated." Margaret turned to her computer and pulled up a map. "Modern property law distinguishes between surface rights and subsurface rights. You own what's under the ground, but if someone else owns the surface, the actual land, they can make it very difficult for you to access those minerals. I own the surface too. The cabin, the land around it. How much land?" Hank thought about it. "Maybe 5 acres? That's what my father always said." Margaret made a note. "We'll need to verify that with the county records. But here's the problem. Even if you own 5 acres, Garrett and his group may have been quietly buying up the surrounding land. If they control the access roads, if they own the parcels adjacent to yours, they can effectively landlord you. Can they do that? It's perfectly legal, unfortunately. It's called strategic acquisition." She paused. "But it works both ways. If you control the only viable access point to the mineral deposits, then they need you as much as you need them." "I'm not interested in negotiating." Margaret smiled slightly. "I admire the sentiment, Mr. Travers, but you need to be realistic. These people have resources you don't have. Money, legal teams, political connections. They can tie you up in court for years. So what do you suggest?" "I suggest we establish your legal claim beyond any doubt. We file this deed with the county, we get a survey done of your property boundaries, and we make it very clear that you're not going anywhere. Then when Garrett comes back with another offer, and he will, we negotiate from a position of strength." Hank shook his head. "My brother kept this secret for 20 years. There must be a reason." There probably was. Back then, filing mineral rights claims publicly would have brought every prospector and mining company to your doorstep. Your grandfather was protecting the land by keeping it quiet. But times have changed. Garrett already knows about the minerals. The secret's out. Now your best protection is making sure everyone knows you own the rights, legally and unquestionably." Hank considered this. The logic made sense, but something in his gut resisted. "How much is your retainer?" he asked. $10,000. That covers the initial filing, the survey, and basic representation for the first month." Hank reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope of cash. He counted out 10,000 in old bills and placed them on her desk. Margaret looked at the money, then at him. "Mr. Travers, where did this cash come from?" "Found it in my cabin." "Along with the deed, all right. I need to document this properly." She pulled out a receipt book and started writing. I'm documenting this as payment from personal savings discovered on your property. Keep your copy of this receipt." She finished writing and handed him the receipt. Then she stood and extended her hand. "You've hired yourself a lawyer, Mr. Travers. Starting tomorrow, I'll file a motion with the county clerk's office to record your mineral rights deed. I'll also reach out to a surveyor I trust. In the meantime, do not let anyone onto your property without a proper warrant. And if they show up with one, you call me immediately. Understood?" "Understood. One more thing. Pete mentioned a town meeting tomorrow night. I think you should attend. Garrett's going to present his development plan, and it's important that the community sees you there. It sends a message." "What kind of message?" "That you're not afraid. That you're not going anywhere," she smiled. "Small-town politics matter, Mr. Travers. Public opinion matters. Right now, Garrett controls the narrative. It's time to change that." Hank left the office with Copper, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across Kalispell's quiet streets. He felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the burden with someone who knew how to fight had taken some of the weight off his shoulders. The drive back to the cabin took longer than expected. Traffic slowed near Columbia Falls, where a logging truck had jackknifed. By the time Hank made it back up the mountain trail, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He parked near the cabin and sat there for a moment, just looking at the place. It was a wreck, no question. But it was his wreck, his family's wreck. Copper jumped out of the truck and immediately started barking at the cabin. Hank's hand went to his rifle. "What is it, boy?" The dog was staring at the front door, hackles raised, growling low in his throat. Hank approached slowly, rifle ready. The door was closed. He'd made sure of that before he left, but something felt wrong. The air smelled different. There was a scent of cigarette smoke, faint but distinct. Someone had been here. He pushed the door open with his boot, staying to one side. The cabin was empty, but it had definitely been searched. The old table was moved. The sleeping bag had been unrolled and tossed aside, and the floorboards near the wood stove, the boards he'd carefully replaced, had been pried up again. The tin box was gone. Hank stood there, staring at the empty space, feeling a cold rage building in his chest. They'd come while he was in Kalispell. They'd broken into his home and stolen what was his, but they hadn't gotten everything. The deed was with Margaret Chen. The money he'd taken for the retainer was safe. But the rest, the gold coins, the remaining cash that was gone, about $63,000, just vanished. Copper whined beside him, sensing his anger. Hank pulled out his phone and checked the trail camera notifications. Sure enough, there were images from about 2 hours ago. A white pickup truck with county plates. 2 men in work clothes, faces partially visible. One of them was carrying a crowbar. He saved the images and called Margaret Chen. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Travers? They broke into my cabin. Stole everything except the deed. I've got them on camera." There was a brief pause. "Do not confront them. Do not do anything. I'm calling the state police right now. The sheriff's office is compromised, so we're going to the state level. Stay at your property. Document everything you can, and do not touch anything. This just became a criminal case, and we're going to use it." She hung up before he could respond. Hank stood there in his ransacked cabin, Copper pressed against his leg, and felt something shift inside him. They'd crossed a line. They'd come onto his property, violated his home, stolen what little he had. They thought they could intimidate him, thought they could drive him away with threats and theft and corruption. They were wrong. Hank Travers had come home to die, but he'd be damned if he'd die quietly. If Garrett and Dawson wanted a fight, they were going to get one. And they were going to learn that sometimes the most dangerous man is the one with nothing left to lose. The state police arrived just after dark, 2 troopers in a patrol car, their expressions suggesting they'd heard enough about Pinewood Valley to know what they were walking into. The older one, Trooper Martinez, had grey at his temples and the careful bearing of a man who'd seen plenty of small-town corruption in his time. Hank showed them the cabin, the pried-up floorboards, the missing tin box. He showed them the trail camera footage on his phone, clear images of 2 men in county work shirts, one with a crowbar, the other carrying the tin box. Martinez studied the images, zooming in on the faces. You recognize these men? Not personally, but those are county trucks. And they were here while Sheriff Dawson knew I'd be in Kalispell meeting with my lawyer. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Travers. It's the truth. Dawson was here yesterday with Tom Garrett, trying to force an inspection. When I refused, he threatened me. Today, while I'm gone, my property gets robbed by men driving county vehicles. Martinez exchanged a look with his partner. We'll need to take statements, photograph everything, collect what evidence we can. This is now an active investigation. I'm going to be straight with you, though. If local officials are involved, this is going to get complicated. How complicated? The kind where people start losing their jobs, or the kind where evidence mysteriously disappears. Depends on how deep the corruption goes. Martinez walked around the cabin, examining the door, the windows. You got any enemies, Mr. Travers? Anyone besides Garrett and the sheriff who might want to cause you trouble? I just got back to town after 20 years. Only enemies I've got are the ones who don't want me here. And that's who exactly? Tom Garrett's development group. They want my land. They want what's under it, Martinez nodded slowly. Mineral rights. That's right, worth a lot. According to my lawyer, could be millions. The trooper let out a low whistle. That's motive enough. All right, Mr. Travers, here's what's going to happen. We're going to file a formal report, forward these images to our investigative unit, and have a conversation with Sheriff Dawson about his department's vehicles being used in a crime. But this is going to take time. Weeks, maybe months. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you upgrade your security. I'm not leaving. Stubborn man, Martinez said, but there was respect in his voice. All right. But if anything else happens, you call us directly. Don't go through the local sheriff's office. Understood. I understand. The troopers finished their work, took statements, photographed everything, and left with copies of the trail camera footage. Hank watched their taillights disappear, then went back inside and started cleaning up. It took most of the night. He righted the table, reorganized his gear, replaced the floorboards. The violation of the space bothered him more than the stolen money. This cabin had been a sanctuary, his family's sanctuary, and now it felt compromised. He made a bed on the floor with his sleeping bag, positioned his rifle within arm's reach, and tried to sleep. Copper curled up beside him, a warm presence in the darkness. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every sound made him jolt awake, branches scraping, something scurrying under the foundation, the wind through the pines. But nothing came. No vehicles, no footsteps, no threats. When dawn finally came, Hank gave up on sleep and started coffee on the old wood stove. The morning light filtered through the gaps in the walls, and birds were singing outside. Mountain chickadees and nuthatches, their songs simple and pure. He drank his coffee, standing on the porch, watching the sun rise over the ridge. Somewhere out there, under all that rock and soil, was whatever his grandfather had known about. Copper, maybe. Gold. Something valuable enough that men were willing to break laws to get it. Around mid-morning, Margaret Chen called. "State police contacted me," she said without preamble. "They're opening a formal investigation." That's good news. It means this is on record. It means there's oversight. And it means Garrett and Dawson will have to be more careful. Doesn't get my money back. No, it doesn't. But it gives us leverage. I've also filed your mineral rights deed with the county this morning. It's now part of the public record. You officially own the subsurface rights to that ridge. Hank felt his chest tighten. So it's done. It's done. Which means Garrett knows by now, or he will within the hour. Expect contact. What kind of contact? Could be another offer. Could be legal action. Could be more intimidation. Whatever it is, document everything and call me immediately. She paused. How are you holding up? I'm fine. Mr. Travers, I've worked with a lot of clients in difficult situations. You don't have to pretend with me. You've just been robbed, you're fighting cancer, and you're up against people with significant resources. It's okay to admit this is hard. Hank looked out at the mountains, at the cabin that barely stood, at Copper lying in a patch of sunlight. My brother kept this secret for 20 years. My father for even longer. They protected this land because it meant something to them. Now it's my turn. Hard or not, I'm not walking away. Good, because the town meeting is tonight at 7. I'll be there, and I strongly suggest you are too. Sarah Holland will be there as well. We need to show a united front. I'll be there. After he hung up, Hank spent the rest of the day setting up the remaining trail cameras around the property perimeter. He positioned them carefully, making sure they covered all approaches to the cabin. He also drove into town and bought a heavy-duty padlock and a deadbolt that he installed himself. It wasn't much, but it was something. Small measures of security, small assertions of control. By 6:30 that evening, Hank was cleaned up as best he could manage, shaved, wearing his least worn flannel shirt, his boots cleaned of mud. He looked in the small mirror he'd hung on the wall and saw an old man staring back, weathered and tired, but not broken. Not yet. He loaded copper into the truck and headed down the mountain toward Pinewood Valley Community Center, toward whatever came next. The parking lot was already full when he arrived. Cars and trucks lined the street, and people were streaming into the building. Ranchers and loggers, shopkeepers and teachers. Old-timers who remembered when the valley was nothing but timber and hard work. Newcomers who'd moved here for the scenery and the peace. Hank parked at the far end of the lot and sat there for a moment, gathering himself. This was it, the moment where he either stood up and fought for what was his, or slunk away and let Garrett and his people take everything. There was really no choice at all. He got out of the truck, told Copper to stay, and walked toward the community center, toward the light and noise and the battle that waited inside. The community center was packed. Folding chairs arranged in rows faced a small stage where a podium and projection screen had been set up. The air was thick with conversation and the smell of coffee. Hank recognized some faces, people who'd been here 20 years ago, now older, grayer. Others were strangers, newcomers with no memory of the Travers family. Sarah Holland spotted him from across the room and waved him over. She'd saved a seat near the middle. Margaret Chen sat beside her, dressed in a sharp blazer, her laptop open on her knees. "Glad you came," Sarah said as Hank sat down. "Didn't have much choice. There's always a choice. You chose to fight. That matters." The lights dimmed, and Tom Garrett took the stage, looking every bit the successful developer. Polished, confident, smiling. Behind him, the projection screen lit up with Pinewood Valley Development Initiative, over pristine mountain wilderness. "Good evening, everyone," Garrett began, his voice smooth. "Thank you for coming tonight. I know many of you have questions about our plans for the valley, and I'm here to provide answers and share our vision." He clicked a remote. The screen showed architectural renderings of upscale cabins nestled among pines, a central lodge with soaring windows, hiking trails with elegant signage. It all looked tasteful, minimal, respectful. What we're proposing is a sustainable development that will bring jobs, tourism revenue, and economic growth while preserving the natural beauty that makes this place special. We're talking about a $50 million investment. Construction jobs, hospitality jobs, long-term employment for dozens of families, the crowd murmured. Some nodding, others skeptical. "I know change is hard," Garrett said, his tone shifting to something more personal. "I know some of you have deep roots here, but I want to assure you this project is about enhancing the valley, not destroying it. We've conducted extensive environmental studies, consulted with forestry experts, designed everything to minimize impact." Another click. The screen showed charts and graphs, projected tax revenues, employment numbers, economic impact studies. "There is, however, one obstacle," Garrett said, and his smile tightened slightly. "A property dispute involving a key parcel of land that sits right in the middle of our planned development area. Some of you may know the old Travers cabin. It's been abandoned for years, a hazard and an eyesore. We've made generous offers to acquire this property, but the current owner has refused to negotiate." Hank felt eyes turning toward him. "I respect property rights," Garrett continued, a note of regret in his voice. "I truly do. But there comes a point where one person's stubbornness shouldn't hold back an entire community's progress. This development would bring prosperity to all of you, but it can't move forward if we can't secure the necessary land." Margaret leaned over and whispered, "He's trying to turn the town against you." "Get ready." Garrett opened the floor to questions. "Hands shut up. What kind of jobs are we talking about?" "Construction jobs in the first phase, hospitality once we're operational. We estimate 150 jobs total, with competitive wages. What about water rights? That development would strain the aquifer." "Excellent question. We've done hydrogeological studies, and I can assure you our water usage will be sustainable." More questions came about traffic, wildlife, property taxes, whether local businesses would benefit. Garrett answered them all smoothly, always circling back to prosperity and progress. Then an older man in the front row stood up. Bill Harper, who'd owned the hardware store for 40 years. "What about this property dispute? Seems to me if a man owns his land, he's got a right to keep it." "Absolutely," Garrett said. "But when that land blocks development that could benefit hundreds of people, there are legal mechanisms. Eminent domain, for instance. The county can acquire property for public benefit with fair compensation." The crowd went quiet. Eminent domain was a loaded term in Pinewood Valley. Margaret Chen stood up. "If I may interject, I'm Margaret Chen, attorney for Mr. Hank Travers. Eminent domain requires proof of public benefit and fair market value compensation. Mr. Garrett's development is a private for-profit venture. It doesn't qualify." Garrett's smile never wavered. "Ms. Chen, I think you'll find that the county has already begun proceedings to designate this area as an economic development zone, which does qualify under Montana law." Hank felt his chest tighten. They were going to take his land through legal channels. "Furthermore," Garrett continued, looking directly at Hank, "there are questions about the legal status of Mr. Travers's claim. The property has been in dispute for decades, with unclear title. We filed a motion with the county to review all claims and determine rightful ownership." Sarah Holland stood up, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Tom Garrett has been buying up land all over this valley, making promises about jobs and prosperity. But ask the Johnson family how that worked out. Ask the Rodriguezes. Ask any of the families who sold to his group and then watched as the promised jobs went to outsiders." "Ms. Holland," Garrett said, his smile showing strain, "I understand you have personal grievances, but this isn't the forum." "This is exactly the forum," Sarah shot back. "You're asking this community to support your project to back your land grab. But you're not being honest about what you're really after." Garrett's expression hardened. "And what exactly am I after?" Before Sarah could answer, Hank stood up. The room went quiet. "Minerals," Hank said, his voice steady. "You're after the mineral rights. Copper deposits, rare earth elements. My grandfather secured those rights in 1923, and they belong to me now. That's what this is really about. Not jobs, not prosperity. Just money." The room erupted in whispers. Garrett's face went carefully neutral. "Mr. Travers," Garrett said slowly, "I don't know where you're getting your information." "From the deed I filed with the county this morning," Hank interrupted. "From the surveys your people did illegally on my land. From the break-in yesterday, where someone stole from my cabin while you and Sheriff Dawson knew I'd be in Kalispell." Sheriff Dawson, standing near the back, stepped forward. "That's a serious accusation, Travers. You better be able to back it up. State police have the evidence. Trail camera footage of county vehicles, county employees breaking into my property." Hank looked around the room. "This man is trying to take what's mine through intimidation, theft, and legal manipulation. And he's using all of you as justification." "That's absurd," Garrett started, but Margaret cut him off. "Actually, we have documentation of everything Mr. Travers just described. The illegal surveys, the harassment, the theft. It's all part of an ongoing criminal investigation. So before this town commits to supporting Mr. Garrett's project, you might want to consider who you're really dealing with." The room exploded into conversation, everyone talking at once. Then something unexpected happened. An older woman stood up near the front. Hank didn't recognize her at first. She was small, maybe 70, with white hair and sharp eyes. "My name is Ellen Travers. I'm Hank's cousin, though we haven't spoken in 35 years. She looked directly at Hank. "Your father and mine had a falling out over that land. My father claimed he had a right to it, too. Said your grandfather promised him a share. The fight nearly destroyed our family. Hank felt the floor tilt. He had vague memories of his father mentioning a cousin, mentioning some dispute. I never pursued it, Ellen continued. Figured it wasn't worth tearing the family apart any more than it already was. But if there's mineral rights involved, if there's real money to be had, then maybe I do have a claim. Maybe this property dispute is more complicated than Mr. Travers wants to admit. Garrett's smile returned, wider than before. Well, this is certainly an interesting development. It seems Mr. Travers' claim to the property may not be as clear-cut as his lawyer suggests. Margaret's expression remained calm, but Hank could see tension in her jaw. If there were competing claims, if family members disputed ownership, it could tie everything up in court for years. And suddenly, Hank understood Garrett's game. He didn't need to win outright. He just needed to create enough legal chaos that no one could develop those mineral rights until the disputes were resolved. And in that time, he could continue buying surrounding land, building political support, positioning himself to take everything. Hank looked at Ellen. At this cousin he barely remembered, and saw something in her eyes, guilt maybe, or regret. But she'd said her piece and she couldn't take it back now. The meeting dissolved into chaos. People shouted questions. Garrett tried to regain control. Margaret was on her phone immediately. Sarah grabbed Hank's arm. Come on. We need to get you out of here before this gets worse. They pushed through the crowd and made it outside into the cool night air. His truck sat at the far end of the parking lot, copper visible through the window. Who is she? Margaret demanded, catching up with them. Your cousin. Is her claim legitimate? I don't know, Hank said honestly. I was too young to remember. My father never talked about it. Well, we need to find out, and fast. Because if she has any legitimate claim to that property, Garrett's going to use it to block everything we're trying to do. Hank looked back at the community center, at the lights and the noise and the chaos he'd helped create. He'd come here to fight for what was his, to stand up to Garrett and Dawson and everyone who wanted to take his land. He just hadn't expected the fight to come from his own family. Hank didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch of the cabin with his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness, listening to every sound. Copper lay beside him, ears twitching at the nocturnal symphony of the mountains, owls hunting, something larger moving through the underbrush, the wind making the pines whisper secrets to each other. He kept thinking about Ellen Travers, his cousin. He had fragments of memory now that she'd forced them to the surface. A family gathering when he was maybe 8 or 9, his father and another man arguing in low, angry voices while the women tried to keep things civil. He remembered his mother saying something about family shouldn't fight over land, and his father replying that and things are worth fighting for. Had his grandfather really promised Ellen's father a share? Or was this just opportunism, someone seeing money and deciding to make a claim? Hank didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. Around 3 a.m, his phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Chen. Found something. Come to my office first thing tomorrow. Bring any family documents you have. Hank texted back, what did you find? The response came quickly. Not discussing over text. 8 a.m. Be there. When dawn finally came, Hank was exhausted but wired, running on coffee and stubborn determination. He fed Copper, gathered what few family documents he had, mostly old photographs and his grandfather's ledger, and headed down the mountain. Margaret's office looked different in the early morning light. The receptionist hadn't arrived yet, but Margaret was there, looking like she hadn't slept much either. Her desk was covered with papers, old maps, legal documents spread out in organized chaos. Sit down, she said without preamble. I spent half the night at the county records office and the other half on the phone with a genealogist friend of mine. Here's what I found. She pulled out a document, old and fragile, protected in a clear sleeve. This is your grandfather Samuel's will, filed in 1954. It explicitly names your father, William Travers, as sole heir to all property, including mineral rights. No mention of any other heirs or claims. What about Ellen's father? Thomas Travers, Samuel's younger brother. According to records, Thomas worked on the property for several years in the 20s and 30s. There are ledger entries showing payments to him for labor, but there's no deed, no contract, no legal document giving him ownership or rights to the land. Hank felt something loosen in his chest. So she has no claim. Not a legal one. But that doesn't mean she can't cause trouble. She can file a motion contesting the will, claiming oral agreements or promises that were never documented. It'll get thrown out eventually, but it takes time. And time is what Garrett wants. Margaret pulled out another document. But here's where it gets interesting. I did some digging into Garrett's company. The development group is called Mountain Ridge Holdings, registered in Delaware. Standard practice for hiding ownership. But if you dig deep enough, follow the shell companies and the investment groups, you find something interesting. She turned her laptop toward Hank. On the screen was a corporate filing document, dense with legal language and names. The primary investor in Mountain Ridge Holdings is a mining conglomerate called Apex Resource Partners. They're based in Butte, and they specialize in copper extraction. Over the past 5 years, they've been systematically acquiring mineral rights across Montana, often through proxies and development companies. So Garrett's just the front man. Exactly. Apex Resources is the real player here. They've done the surveys. They know what's under your ridge, and they're willing to spend millions to get it. Garrett's development plan is just window dressing. A way to get public support for taking your land. Hank stared at the screen, at the names and numbers that represented something so much larger than one old man and his falling down cabin. How much is it worth? The mineral deposits? Based on the surveys they did, which I obtained through a source at the State Environmental Office, you're sitting on an estimated $30 to $40 million in recoverable copper, plus rare earth elements that could add another 10 to 20 million. That's a conservative estimate, $50 to $60 million. Hank tried to wrap his mind around that number and couldn't. It was abstract, meaningless in the context of his life. He'd never had more than a few $1,000s at one time. The idea of owning mineral rights worth that much felt like a joke. They'll never let me keep it, he said quietly. No, they won't, not without a fight. Margaret closed her laptop and looked at him directly. Here's where we stand. Your legal claim is solid. Ellen's claim is weak and will likely be dismissed. But Garrett has already started eminent domain proceedings through the county. They're claiming your land is necessary for public infrastructure, access roads for the development, which would give them the right to take it with compensation. Can they do that? They can try. We can fight it, argue that it's really for private benefit rather than public good. But that fight happens in court, and it takes months, maybe years. In the meantime, you can't develop the mineral rights, and neither can anyone else. The land is effectively frozen. Hank felt the walls closing in. Every direction he turned, there was another obstacle, another legal trap, another delay. So what do I do? Margaret was quiet for a moment, then pulled out one more document. There's another option. We can negotiate a deal directly with Apex Resources. Cut out Garrett, cut out the county, go straight to the source. You maintain ownership of the surface rights, your cabin, your 5 acres, and you license the mineral rights to them for extraction with a percentage of the profits coming to you. How much? Industry standard is 10 to 15% of net profits. On a $50 million deposit, you'd be looking at $5 to $7 million over the life of the mine. Enough to live comfortably for whatever time you have left. Enough to leave a legacy. Enough to tell Garrett and Dawson to go to hell. Hank thought about it. $5 to $7 million. It was still an incomprehensible amount, but it was also a solution. A way out of the legal maze. A way to keep his land and still benefit from what was under it. But something about it felt wrong. Like giving in, like letting them win. What would Ray have done? He asked, more to himself than to Margaret. I didn't know your brother, Mr. Travers, but from everything you've told me, he protected this land for 20 years without touching what was hidden under it. He could have cashed in any time, but he didn't. He kept it safe, kept it secret, and trusted you to make the right decision. Hank looked at the documents spread across Margaret's desk, at the evidence of conspiracy and greed and legal maneuvering. He thought about his grandfather working this land, his father raising a family here, Ray refusing to compromise even when it might have made his life easier. "I need time to think," he said. "You don't have much time." Garrett's pushing hard. The county's moving forward with eminent domain, and Ellen's claim, frivolous as it is, adds ammunition to the argument that ownership is unclear. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "I'm not telling you what to decide, Mr. Travers. I'm just laying out the options. But you need to decide soon." Hank left the office with his head spinning. He sat in his truck for a long time, Copper beside him, watching the morning traffic move through Kalispell. Regular people going to regular jobs, living regular lives that didn't involve mineral rights and corporate conspiracies and family betrayals. He envied them. His phone rang. Unknown number. Hank almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Travers?" "This is Ellen Travers." "Your cousin." Hank said nothing, waiting. "I know you probably think I'm just trying to cash in," Ellen continued, her voice uncertain. "Maybe I am. But I wanted you to know, after the meeting last night, Tom Garrett approached me. He offered me $200,000 to pursue my claim, to tie you up in court, to make your life difficult. And you're considering it. I considered it. 200,000 is a lot of money for someone like me. I'm living on Social Security and a tiny pension. My husband died 5 years ago, left me with medical debt. That money would change my life," she paused. "But then I went home and looked at old family photos, found pictures of your father and mine when they were boys, before the falling out. They looked happy. They were brothers once, before land and money got between them." "What are you saying, Ellen?" "I'm saying I'm not taking Garrett's money. I'm saying my claim was made in anger and regret, and it's not legitimate. Your grandfather's will is clear. The land goes to Williams Line, which means it's yours. I'm going to withdraw my claim tomorrow morning." Hank felt something catch in his throat. "Why?" "Because we're family, Hank, and family shouldn't let people like Garrett use us against each other. My father would be ashamed of me for even considering it, and I'm ashamed of myself for what I did at that meeting." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry." "Thank you," Hank managed to say. "There's something else. Garrett's planning something. I overheard him talking to Sheriff Dawson after I turned down his offer. Something about accelerating the timeline and taking care of the problem directly. I don't know what it means, but it didn't sound good." "Watch your back, cousin." She hung up before he could ask anything else. Hank sat there, phone in hand, Ellen's warning echoing in his mind. Taking care of the problem directly. That could mean a lot of things, none of them good. He called Margaret immediately. "Ellen's withdrawing her claim, but Garrett's planning something. We need to move fast." "What kind of something?" "I don't know. But I'm not waiting around to find out. What are you going to do?" Hank looked at Copper, at the mountains visible in the distance, at the blue Montana sky that seemed to stretch forever. He thought about his grandfather and his father and Ray, about the land they'd protected, about the legacy they'd left him. "I'm going to end this," he said, "one way or another. I'm going to end it." He hung up and started driving back to the cabin, back to the ridge, back to the place where everything had started and where everything would finish. It was time to stop running. Stop reacting. Stop letting Garrett and his people control the narrative. It was time to fight back. Hank made it back to the cabin by noon. The trail cameras had captured nothing unusual overnight, but Ellen's warning had put him on edge. He spent the afternoon preparing, not for compromise, not for negotiation, but for whatever Garrett had planned. He cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, made sure the trail cameras were positioned to cover every approach. He moved his truck behind the cabin where it couldn't be seen from the main trail. He filled every container he had with water from the creek, packed a go bag with essentials in case he needed to move fast. It felt like preparing for a siege, which maybe it was. Around 3 in the afternoon, Pete Carver's green Chevy came up the trail. Hank watched through the window until he was sure it was Pete, then stepped outside. Pete got out, his face grim. "You need to leave, Hank, right now." "What's going on?" "I was at Murphy's feed this morning." Overheard 2 of Garrett's men talking. "They're planning to burn you out tonight." Make it look like an accident. Old cabin, faulty wood stove, tragic but inevitable. With you and the cabin gone, Garrett can claim the land's abandoned, speed up the eminent domain process. Hank felt cold despite the afternoon sun. They'd kill me? They'd make it look like you died in an accidental fire. No proof, no witnesses, just an old man who didn't maintain his property properly. Pete's expression was hard. I'm not asking, Hank, I'm telling you. Get in your truck and drive away from here. Go to Kalispell. Stay with your lawyer. Let the legal process work. Don't give them an excuse to do something permanent. If I leave, they win. If you stay, you die. There's no winning if you're dead. Hank looked at the cabin, at the sagging roof and rotted boards, at the land that had been in his family for generations. He thought about Ray's letter, about his father's legacy, about his grandfather securing mineral rights 100 years ago so his family would have something of value. I'm not leaving, Pete. Damn it. Hank, I'm not leaving, Hank repeated, his voice firm. But I appreciate the warning. More than you know. Pete stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You're a stubborn fool just like your brother. Ray wouldn't leave either, even when I told him he should. He stayed until the cancer took him, stayed right here on this land because it meant something to him. It means something to me, too. Then at least let me help. I'll park down the trail out of sight. If anyone comes tonight, I'll be there. You won't face this alone. Hank wanted to refuse, wanted to say this wasn't Pete's fight. But the truth was he needed help, and Pete was offering it freely, asking nothing in return, except the satisfaction of standing up to people who thought they could burn a man out of his home. All right, Hank said. Thank you, Pete nodded. I'll head down now, find a spot where I can watch the trail. You see or hear anything, you call me. And Hank, keep that rifle close. After Pete left, Hank called Margaret and told her everything. Ellen's warning, Pete's information about the planned fire, his decision to stay. Mr. Travers, this is insane. If they're really planning to kill you, then I need witnesses, I need documentation, and I need the state police on standby. Can you arrange that? There was a long pause. You're using yourself as bait. I'm defending my property. There's a difference, not much of one. Another pause. All right. I'll call Trooper Martinez. Tell him what we know. I'll also call the county fire marshal. Put them on alert. And I'm driving up there myself. I'll park on the main road with my phone recording. If anything happens, we'll have evidence. Margaret, you don't have to. Yes, I do. You're my client, and I'm not letting Garrett get away with this. I'll be there by 6. Don't do anything stupid before then. She hung up before he could respond. Hank spent the next 2 hours setting up. He moved Copper to the truck with food and water. If things went bad, he wanted the dog safe. He positioned himself on the porch, where he could see the entire clearing and the trail leading up to it. He kept his rifle loaded and ready, his phone charged and within reach. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening, the afternoon cooling into evening. Birds went quiet. The wind died down. Everything felt suspended, waiting. At 7:30, as the sun was setting behind the western ridge, his phone buzzed with a trail camera alert. 3 vehicles coming up the mountain. 2 white pickups with county plates and a black SUV he didn't recognize. Hank's heart started pounding. He sent the images to Margaret, to Pete, to Trooper Martinez's number that Margaret had forwarded to him. Then he stood up, rifle in hand, and waited. The vehicles emerged from the trees, slow, deliberate, headlights off despite the fading light. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, doors opening, men getting out, 5 of them. 2 carried gas cans. 1 had a crowbar. The other 2 had rifles of their own. Sheriff Dawson stepped out of the black SUV, his uniform exchanged for civilian clothes, his expression cold and determined. "Last chance, Travers," Dawson called out. "Walk away now and nobody gets hurt. Stay, and this cabin burns with you in it." Hank raised his rifle to his shoulder, aimed at the ground in front of Dawson's feet, and fired once. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the clearing, birds exploding from the trees, the sharp smell of gunpowder cutting through the evening air. "This is my land," Hank said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "And I'm not going anywhere." For a moment nobody moved. The gunshot still echoed in Hank's ears, and he could see the calculation happening on Dawson's face. Surprise, anger, reassessment. The men with gas cans took a step back, suddenly less confident. "You just fired on a law enforcement officer," Dawson said, his voice tight. "You're not in uniform. You're on my property without a warrant, and you're threatening arson." "You're not here as a law enforcement officer, Sheriff. You're here as a criminal." One of the men with rifles, young, maybe 30, with the build of someone who spent more time at the gym than outdoors, started to raise his weapon. Hank swung his rifle toward him. "Don't," Hank said quietly. "I've got nothing to lose, son. Can you say the same?" The young man hesitated, looked at Dawson, then slowly lowered his rifle. "You're making a mistake, Travers," Dawson said. "You think help is coming? You think anyone's going to save you? We own this valley. We own the county officials. We own the judges. We own everything that matters. You're just one old man with a rifle and a death sentence already hanging over your head." "Maybe," Hank said. "But I'm not the one who's going to prison for attempted murder and arson. There's no evidence. There's trail camera footage of you and your boys breaking into my cabin. There's footage of you right now, standing on my property with gas cans. And there's 3 witnesses on their way, my lawyer, a friend, and a state trooper. All of them know exactly what you're planning." Dawson's expression faltered slightly. "You're bluffing, am I? You want to test that theory? You want to light that match and see if the state police show up before or after my cabin burns?" The sound of an engine came from down the trail, a big engine moving fast. Dawson spun around, and a moment later, Pete Carver's Chevy roared into the clearing, followed immediately by a state police patrol car, lights flashing. Trooper Martinez stepped out, his hand on his sidearm. "Sheriff Dawson, interesting place for an evening visit. Those gas cans part of an official inspection?" Dawson's face went carefully neutral. "We had reports of illegal activity on this property. We were investigating. In civilian clothes? With gas cans? Without calling for backup?" Martinez walked slowly toward the group, his partner moving to flank them. "I'm going to need you and your associates to set those gas cans down and put your hands where I can see them." "Now wait just a minute." I said, "Put them down and hands up." "This is not a request, Sheriff." One of the men made a sudden move toward his truck. Pete Carver was out of his Chevy in an instant, blocking the path. "Stay right where you are." Margaret Chen's car appeared at the edge of the clearing, and she got out with her phone held high, clearly recording everything. "Good evening, Sheriff Dawson. I'm documenting this encounter for my client's legal protection. Please continue with whatever you were planning to do." Dawson looked around, at the state troopers, at Pete, at Margaret recording, at Hank still standing on his porch with his rifle. The situation had gone from a simple intimidation operation to a potential disaster, and Hank could see the panic starting to show through Dawson's composure. "This is a misunderstanding," Dawson said, his voice taking on a conciliatory tone. "We were simply trying to convince Mr. Travers to relocate for his own safety. The cabin is structurally unsound, and we were concerned about his safety." Martinez finished, his tone making it clear what he thought of that excuse. "That's why you brought gas cans. Very safety conscious of you." "Trooper, I think you're misinterpreting." "I'm interpreting just fine, Sheriff. Here's what's going to happen. You and your associates are going to leave this property immediately. Then you're going to report to my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for formal questioning regarding the break-in that occurred at this location 3 days ago. And if I find out that any harm comes to Mr. Travers or his property, I'm going to personally make sure that every agency in Montana knows that a county sheriff was involved in intimidation, theft, and attempted arson. You can't prove. We have trail camera footage, witness statements, and now video recording of you on this property with gas cans after making threats. Want me to keep going? Because I can. And I promise you, Sheriff, it won't end well for you." Dawson's jaw clenched. He looked at Hank one more time, and in that look was pure hatred, not just anger at being thwarted, but genuine loathing for a man who wouldn't bend, wouldn't break, wouldn't disappear when he was supposed to. "This isn't over," Dawson said quietly. "Yeah, it is," Hank replied. "It's over." You just don't know it yet. Dawson and his men loaded back into their vehicles and drove away, leaving the gas cans behind as evidence. As their taillights disappeared down the trail, Hank finally lowered his rifle, his hands shaking with adrenaline and relief. Martinez approached the porch. "Mr. Travers, you took one hell of a risk tonight. Seemed like the only option left. Well, you've got your evidence now. Those gas cans, the video, the testimony. We can build a case against Dawson and whoever's pulling his strings. This is going to make waves." "Good," Hank said. "Let it." Margaret climbed the porch steps, still holding her phone. "I got everything. Dawson threatening you, the gas cans, the whole confrontation. This is enough to destroy him and seriously damage Garrett's operation." Pete walked over, grinning. "Damn, Hank, that was something. Thought for sure we were about to have a shootout." "So did I," Hank admitted. "Thank you, all of you. If you hadn't come when you did—" "But we did," Margaret interrupted. "That's what matters. Now let's get you somewhere safe for the night. Your cabin's still standing, but I think you've pushed your luck far enough for one day." Hank looked at the cabin, at the sagging roof and rotted boards, at the land that had cost him so much to keep. It wasn't much to look at, but it was his. And tonight, he defended it, not with lawyers and documents, but with courage and stubbornness and the willingness to stand his ground when everything told him to run. His father would have been proud. Ray would have been proud. And for the first time since he'd come back to Montana, Hank felt something close to pride himself. 3 weeks later, Hank stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the morning sun paint the ridge in shades of gold and amber. The coffee in his hand was still hot, steam rising into the cool September air. Copper lay at his feet, content and calm, occasionally thumping his tail against the weathered boards. The cabin looked different now. Not perfect, it would never be perfect, but better. Pete had helped him replace some of the worst floorboards, patch the roof in a few critical spots, install proper windows in place of the plywood. It was still old, still worn, still a far cry from anything that would pass a modern inspection. But it was solid. It would stand, just like Hank had. The legal fallout had been swift and devastating for Garrett and his associates. The video of Sheriff Dawson on Hank's property with gas cans had made its way to the state attorney general's office within 48 hours. Dawson had been suspended pending investigation, and 3 of his deputies had already resigned rather than face questioning. The county commissioners had launched their own inquiry into the eminent domain proceedings, and the whole process had ground to a halt. Tom Garrett had disappeared. Not literally, but practically. He'd stopped returning calls, stopped showing up at town meetings, and his office in Missoula had quietly closed. Rumor was he'd fled to Idaho, trying to outrun the legal troubles that were chasing him. The development plan for Pinewood Valley had been indefinitely postponed, and Apex Resource Partners, the mining conglomerate behind everything, had sent their own representatives to meet with Hank, not to threaten. Not to intimidate. To negotiate, Margaret had handled most of it. But Hank had been there for the key meetings. 3 men in expensive suits sitting in Margaret's office, talking about licensing agreements and profit-sharing and long-term partnerships. They'd been professional, respectful even, treating Hank like someone who deserved to be at the table rather than someone to be eliminated from it. In the end, they'd reached an agreement. Hank kept his land, his cabin, his 5 acres of surface rights. Apex got a 20-year license to extract minerals from the ridge, with Hank receiving 15% of net profits. Higher than industry standard. Margaret had negotiated hard on that point. The first payment would come within 6 months, once operations began. Conservative estimates put Hank's lifetime earnings at somewhere between $8 and $10 million. $8 million. For a dying man who'd spent most of his life scraping by, it was almost absurd. But it was also justice, in a way. His grandfather had secured those rights 100 years ago. His father and brother had protected them, and now Hank would ensure they served their purpose. He'd already made arrangements. Most of the money would go into a trust for the valley, scholarships for kids who wanted to go to college, grants for small businesses, support for families struggling with medical bills. Sarah Holland was going to help administer it. P. Carver would be on the board. Even Ellen had agreed to help, her way of making amends for the trouble she'd caused. The land itself would be protected in perpetuity through a conservation easement. No development, no subdivisions, no resort cabins. Just the mountains, and the trees and the wildlife, the way his grandfather had known it, the way it deserved to remain. Hank heard a vehicle coming up the trail and smiled. He knew that engine, Sarah's old Subaru, reliable as sunrise. She pulled into the clearing a moment later, followed by Margaret Chen in her sedan. They'd taken to visiting once or twice a week, checking on him, bringing supplies, just sitting and talking like old friends. Maybe that's what they were now. Friends, family even, the kind you chose rather than the kind you were born with. "Morning, Hank," Sarah called out, carrying a basket that smelled like fresh-baked bread. "Thought you might want some real food instead of whatever you're living on out here? Coffee and determination?" "Mostly," Hank said, but he took the basket gratefully. Margaret came up the steps with her lawyer's briefcase. "Final papers for the trust came through. You need to sign them, and then everything's official." They went inside. The cabin could actually accommodate 3 people now, with the new table Pete had helped build and chairs that didn't threaten to collapse under you. Hank signed the papers while Sarah made more coffee, and for a while they just sat there, comfortable in the silence. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked eventually, and Hank knew she wasn't talking about the legal situation, about the same. "Pain comes and goes. Doctor says I've got maybe 3 more months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky." He smiled. "But I feel better than I have in years." Strange thing, dying. Makes you appreciate what matters, and what matters. Sarah asked gently. Hank looked around the cabin, at the walls his grandfather had built, at the land his family had protected, at the friends who'd stood beside him when it counted. All of this. Not the money, not even the victory. Just knowing that something good came from standing up when it would have been easier to lie down. They talked for another hour, about the valley, about the trust, about plans for winter. Eventually, Margaret had to leave for another appointment, and Sarah followed soon after. Promising to return in a few days, Hank walked them out, watched them drive away, then stood there in the clearing with Copper beside him. The mountains rose up all around, ancient and patient, indifferent to human drama, but somehow grounding in their permanence. He'd come home to die. That was still true. The cancer was still there, still working its slow inevitability through his body. But he'd also come home to live, even if he hadn't known it at the time. To fight for something that mattered. To honor the legacy his family had left him. To prove that one old man with nothing left to lose could still make a difference. The cabin stood behind him, weathered but solid. The ridge stretched before him, hiding its riches beneath rock and soil. And Copper looked up at him with absolute trust, absolute loyalty, asking nothing more than companionship and the occasional scratch behind the ears. Hank Travers had come home, and home, despite everything, had welcomed him back. He picked up his coffee, took a long sip, and smiled at the morning. Whatever time he had left, he'd spend it here, on this land, in this place where his story had begun, and where it would end. And that, he thought, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.